The Russians tried to cross that small stream, a crucial landmark on their way to the new objective set by their leaders. And with every squad sent, more Ukrainian drones hunted them down. The battles were challenging with every step taken by both sides. The Ukrainian resistance was brave, but the Russian advance continued despite the corpses, illustrating the path of the soldiers who kept pushing forward. The Pokrovs offensive represented a new and brutal chapter in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a determined march toward the heart of Donetsk Oblast. After the bloody fall of Abdiivka in February 2024, Russian forces advanced with an unstoppable tide through the north and northwest, carving a dangerous bulge in the front line. In July, the capture of Prorys sealed a grim turning point. The road to Pokrovs was open, and with it, the omen of a fierce battle for one of the last strategic sites in western Donetsk. Russian shelling cleared the way for the troops, forcing the Ukrainians to retreat into the trenches. The capture of Prorys was accomplished in less than 48 hours, with the brutal advances of the Russians marking the beginning of the offensive. The destruction began to create a series of scars toward Pokrovs. The fall of Prorys in July 2024 could already be considered a milestone in the Russians' advance, turning villages into ruins on their way through Donetsk. Since then, cities and villages to the east and south of Pokrovsk have turned into fields of ruin and resistance, where every meter gained cost blood. This offensive was not just a territorial dispute, it was a trial by fire for the morale and survival of the Ukrainian forces who resisted there. As the Russian war machine advanced, they said their farewells. Almost a year after the fall of Prolk, already in April 2025, the Russian advances encountered resistance around Pokrovsk, beginning movements on the flanks of the city to create a stranglehold on the defenses, in the same way they did in Avdiivka and Bakhmut. One of the ways the Russians made their way was by using the 9K-3510. This was a short-range, low-altitude, surface-to-air missile system, developed by the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It was designed to protect ground forces against aerial threats, such as moving airplanes and helicopters. Niche. Now, it's been adapted to shoot down Ukrainian surveillance drones. It was a tough contest. Sometimes, the Russians didn't identify the drones, creating an opportunity for the 10M to become a target. They waited for the defense system to start moving in order to deploy the Kamikaze drone teams. That way, unable to defend itself properly, the Strela 10M became the prey of a feared Kamikaze drone in an explosion amplified by the detonation of its own projectiles. So, the work of hunting down the observation drones had to be done well, or the watchers would reveal the position of the target. Russian soldiers against Ukrainian bomber drones. Once the route of Moscow's squads was discovered, the explosive started to fall. The Pine didn't score a direct hit, but it weakened the Russian enough for the next one to break his body. Exactly in this war, the drones didn't spare the wounded. The fire kept devouring the flesh until there was no chance for that soldier to ever rise again. The 155th Brigade saw the bears getting too close to their positions. From inside the houses, the soldiers pulled the triggers. The sound of death preceded the fall of the bears. They didn't know it, but the 155th was already waiting for them for the fight. The first one fell near the already dried corpse of a comrade. The temperature was still low in April, preserving the dead. The only living soldier tried to fight back. When he showed his silhouette to the gunfire was riddled with Ukrainian bullets. The rest of the squad halted farther back by a ruined shack. They used their rifles and grenades to try to take out the nearest Ukrainians, but the drones were up above. The grenade fell as they tried to escape. One of them was struck down by death. The other still ran through the ruins carrying his rifle. While he was gasping for breath, he entered a shack trying to hide, and they created a better defense. But the roof that the Russian bombings destroyed didn't help at all when the drone dropped fire. Miraculously, he survived. He walked out slowly, terrified, but praying that divine protection would continue. But drones don't listen to prayers. Their cameras saw, without capturing, the sound of the explosion that killed the last soldier of the Russian squad. The battle raged on. The Russians, true to form, didn't know the word surrender. The 155th Ukrainian Brigade tried to survive in those days in Pokrovs, even with the Russians dropping their bombs FAB over their positions. It was not easy at all. The Russians took advantage of the chaos inside the 155th. The 155th Separate Mechanized Brigade. It was a unit of the Ukrainian ground forces created in 2024 to help with the difficult situation at the front. What training did the 155th receive in France at a time when Russian advances were already breaking through Ukrainian defenses in the direction of Pokrovs? The Russians increased their advances aggressively. What was supposed to help soon became a problem. The brigade was formed in 2024 as part of an initiative to expand the Ukrainian army, with the creation of 9 new brigades. In November 2024, the 155th was sent to the south of Pokrovs to reinforce positions, including the locality of Shevchenko. In January 2025, the brigade became the subject of controversy after reports indicated that about 1,700 of its members had deserted or been transferred to other units during the formation process, or in the chaos that occurred during the Russian attacks. The incident resulted in the commander's arrest. The Russians moved confidently against the 155th, but their soldiers were in for a surprise. A large group of Russians advanced toward Pokrovsk. There were almost 24 of them, an unusual number in Moscow's strategies at that stage of the war. The Ukrainian brigades were prepared to receive them, with bombs being fired by the artillery. The Kamikaze drones dove in, and the bomber drones unleashed a bit more death. The bomber drones worked to stop every Russian advance. The 155 was readjusting and began to bring death upon the enemies. The brigade's bomber drones worked to stop every Russian advance. The soldiers endured the pain still in the middle of the fields leveled by explosions, writhing with each new blast.
What programmation and workshaft are discarding.
Those who managed to reach the tree lines met similar fates. Others even entered the trenches and saw their comrades half-charred from previous attacks. One of them tried to defend his life by shooting at the drone so he wouldn't meet the same fate as his partner, still smelling the burnt flesh nearby. The explosive came down and the shockwave hit his legs. The body was still full of smoke when the drone hovered in the sky, once again aiming to drop the explosive with greater precision. The soldier curled up in pain, waiting for the fire that would take his life. Finally, life in the conflict in Ukraine was filled with moments with the expectation of pain and death, despite the fierce resistance with gunfire of every possible caliber. At some point, The suffering reached the body on a dangerous path, like the one the Russians intended to take toward Pokrovs. Ulshiabla. Russian drones were blowing up Ukrainian equipment inside the villages near Pokrovs or in the outskirts of the city. When they managed to get there, the Kamikaze drones relied on equipment produced by Sudaprov. This group started with Russian volunteers, who proudly announced the results of their centralization and growing professionalism 2 years before these conflicts in Pokrovs. The drone, developed by Sudaprov, represented the peak of efficiency among first-person view models, in terms of cost-effectiveness when it began production. It allowed operators to launch munitions weighing from 1.3 to 3 kilograms with lethal precision at average distances of 7 to 10 kilometers. It became a versatile and relentless tool in the theater of modern warfare. The kamikazes were a weapon that was not well understood by many, even after 3 years of war. The Russians used many kamikazes, known as loitering munitions. These unmanned aircraft, loaded with explosives, were not made to return. Guided by global positioning system, infrared sensors, or artificial intelligence, they pursued specific targets, whether vehicles, radars, or soldiers, until the final impact. Although they were used on battlefields, they were more famous for flying their antennas against Ukrainian cities. Russians showed the factories where they kept increasing their production. They were a success that the Kremlin was betting on. The Alapuga factory, located in the Tatarstan region of Russia, invited 9th grade students aged between 14 and 15 to enroll in a technical college run by the company itself nearby. There, they could specialize in drone manufacturing, and after completing the course, go directly to work at the factory. This was a big problem, since that was a military facility that produced hundreds of drones to strike targets in Ukraine and had already been targeted by the Ukrainians. Alongside loitering munitions, first-person view drones, manually piloted by experienced soldiers, have become common on the battlefield. The front line, once marked by direct gunfire, was now a kill zone, with several kilometers of depth, hidden up to 5 kilometers from the combat front. Russian and Ukrainian teams competed for the skies with simple yet lethal airstrikes. Even with the continuous roar of artillery, it was a small quadcopter carrying up to 1 kilogram of explosives and guided with goggles and controls in hand, symbolizing the new era of warfare. Traveling at up to 60 kilometers per hour, these cheap, fast, and effective drones have turned combat into a hunting game between aerial ghosts. The first-person view attacks gave the Russians an opportunity to enter the villages. The Ukrainian patrols had to search for these squads inside the destroyed buildings. They had to walk dodging debris that distracted their vision. Those brief moments were enough for a hidden ruffian to surprise a squad. Ukrainian fell dead, while the others had to flee to warn that the enemies were already in their territory. The 3rd Ukrainian Regiment for Special Purposes was a group of operators well trained to deal with these invaders. The special forces were employed for precise assaults in these dangerous areas, coming from longer training and with more suitable weapons. For many of these confrontations, they chose AKs or standard NATO rifles to walk between the villages in search of the Russians. It was a complicated mission to get through so much rubble. They threw grenades into the hideouts, where they detected enemies, shot at anyone who tried to get out, and took documents from the bodies they found to identify which enemies they were facing. Kuduzali. Sometimes they found children's toys displayed as if they had been placed there, an obvious trap that the Russians used to lead. The Psu, When they didn't solve the whole problem, they started to circle the area to begin demolishing houses and people. The drone's job was to search and destroy. The attached rocket-propelled grenade ammunition was enough to blow up the Russians' hideouts. The survivors sometimes chose to surrender after being cornered, after seeing their friends killed. The Ukrainians needed to keep the Russians away from the villages every day. More and more of them were lost in the direction of Pokrovs. The tanks formed destruction zones. They couldn't think that they were aiming at the homes of their fellow countrymen. That target was simply the hideout of a Russian who needed to be obliterated to prevent further deaths of Ukrainian citizens. Death was inside the Ukrainian trenches. So many times this happened, with Russian FPVs descending upon them, killing so many men who tried to defend Pokrovs. It was too much death. When a Russian approached, some of the fights were fierce. A soldier had to crawl among the corpses of his comrades and the Ukrainians, getting close to a wounded Ukrainian to finish off the enemy for good with multiple stabbings. On the other side of the screen, men cheered as they watched the arm go up and down, making the knife cut into enemy flesh, while the Ukrainians' legs convulsed, overwhelmed by pain and helplessness. The soldiers wanted to prevent their comrades from suffering that violence, and the only way was to unleash the violence first against the enemy. The 38th Ukrainian Marine Brigade did this with bomber drones hunting the Russians among the trees. The bombs fell on every place where they stopped to rest. A Russian could only stop being a target when what was left of him was a corpse. But they kept advancing with their armored vehicles, full of soldiers. The Kamikazes filled those BMPs or BTRs with smoke, forcing the men to disembark. While the bomber drones completely ended the transport vehicle's function, the explosions started to hunt down the soldiers across the field. The drone operators had to be careful when searching for the Russians among the trees. They tried to hide with varying degrees of success, depending on the resources they had. Even so, the drones kept flying, leaving more and more bodies lying in the direction of Pokrovs. Sometimes the Russians simply overused their strategies, sending the Bukanka vehicles directly into the attack. These vehicles were very versatile and designed for the battlefield, but that was very different from sending them into a direct confrontation. A Ukrainian with a heavy machine gun in his bunker greeted those Russians with heavy ammunition. The shots pierced the Bukanka as if it were paper. Contrary to what many thought, a car without proper armor didn't protect anyone from rifle or machine gun fire, except in areas like the engine. The result was more bodies for Feder in front of the Ben-served trenches. At a certain point, the Russians' objective was to cross a small stream. It was just a few swampy meters with an improvised bridge used by the peasants. It should have been easy for the Russians to cross, but the soldier found nothing of the bridge when he got there. What there was only icy water, making his steps even harder in the mud. That made Death's job easier, falling upon a distracted man with the muddy water ahead. He tried to call for help on the radio, but he collapsed, rotting in the stream. The Ukrainians even let two of them cross the river to see what it was like on the other side. It was a wicked move. The crystal clear water turned muddy under their steps. When finally, one of them happily came out of the water, the bomber drone unleashed death. The explosion made one of them sink into the water, while the other tried to call for support over the radio. The man in the icy stream tried to breathe, looking up almost in a trance. He ran his wicked fingers across his face to take him away. The other one moved desperate, full of pain. He started to redden the water, hoping for help, Just like the first corpse lying beside him, the Ukrainians could have given him time to bleed to death or drown.
But the Kamikaze drone came shortly after.
The orders didn't stop. The bears had to move on to Pokrovs, and that was just one of the routes. Small, without major battles, but emblematic of the series of Russian victories. In those waters, many drowned, lost amid the smoke, gunfire, or explosions. Others simply walked past the cadaverous marks of the Russian victories, waiting for their moment. The bomb came for the soldier. He fell to the ground, soaked with water and blood, just a little further ahead. From the corpses of so many Russians scattered in the same region, so many of them fallen, men forgotten during the conquest of a few meters of land. Meaningless, without any remembrance in history. Just another piece of land where the Russians fertilized the soil. The Ukrainian drones made sure to punish the Russian advance. Some soldiers were turned into martyrs, burning on the ground in that desperate suffering of war. The Russians advanced Kisak. Even at that cost, there were those willing to pay the price for the conquest of Donetsk. There were many reasons, from the political propaganda that the Borsas love, to all the riches beneath the soil of eastern Ukraine. So, the massacre continued. Drones flew, wiping dozens of villages off the map.